Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and Howl the Wild is just so chock full of new things. Witches get 3 new patrons, which means 3 new familiars and 3 new hex cantrips, some new greater lessons, and some new feats. We're going to go over all that here in this video. It blows my mind the number of options. You would figure, 6 new ancestries, 8 new archetypes, a bunch of items would be enough, but no. They're just adding more and more and more. And this is really just the first book of new options in the year. And we're just going to be getting more of that later in the year. It's absolutely insane. If you don't want to miss any of that, I recommend subscribing to the channel like right now, because I'm covering everything as much as I can. There's also PaizoCon at the end of the year. It's a digital event that I will be covering to the best of my abilities, everything that's new that they're talking about. And as well, the Remaster 2, the Player Core 2 is coming out this July, which is going to have all kinds of changes for your favorite classes. So that being the case, also leave a like. It helps the video get to more bigger audience, and as well, it helps the channel out a lot, and I really appreciate it. But let's go ahead and talk today about the new patrons that are coming with Howl of the Wild. Starting off, we have the Devour of Decay. This is the myconid, mushroom fungus-y style one, or the end of life one. It's the Decay patron, more or less. Now, all of these patrons are going to be of the nature skill set and the primal spell set. That's Howl the Wild is the nature book, so obviously all of these are going to be primal. I know a lot of people out there were hoping for like some more arcane or even divine. Those will probably come out in some other books, but for today anyway, we have 3 new primal patrons. So, Devour of Decay. First, you get the Lesson of the Hungry Scavenger, which gives you Scavenger's Glee, a really good hex cantrip. In addition, your familiar learns Enfeeble, which is really good. What I really like about Devour of Decay is it is a very heavy debuff style of patron. I know a lot of them are very debuff focused, but I feel like Devour of Decay is one of the stronger ones when it comes in that kind of fashion. And what I mean by that is Scrounger's Glee is really, really good. So it's a hex cantrip you use, has to be on a creature within 30 feet, and they need to make a will save. This is a hex cantrip, but if the target fails, they're frightened 1, and if they crit fail, they're frightened 2. And this lasts for as long as you're sustaining the spell. That is huge. Well, not quite to the same capacity as Bard's Dirge of Doom, which, to be fair, is an 8th level feat. This is still really, really good. It's so solid that just the enemy fails, boom, this permanent -1 to everything. That's good. That's super strong. If they crit fail, if you get lucky on a crit fail, -2 to everything. That's good. And there is an additional effect. You can dismiss this spell as a reaction when an ally critically hits the enemy. Has to be with a strike specifically, so it can't be a spell or anything else like that. But that ally will then restore a D4 hit points. And as the spell heightens every odd level, it will restore an additional D4 hit points. Now, I would have personally have just done this every level. I don't think 94 HP at endgame or 10d4 HP at endgame really would have made that much of a difference. And the heightening doesn't really do anything else. So the heightened every odd is strange, to say the least. Especially because, you're likely to get a 2 or 3 per die that you roll, which is just really not a lot. So Scrounger's Glee, I think, could have done heightened every level and been perfectly fine. But otherwise, the cantrip itself is insanely good. Like I said, a permanent frightened on a target is incredibly solid. Now, for our familiar from the Devour of Decay, we have the Parasitic Might, which is a little scary. It's a really cool familiar, though. So whenever you cast or sustain a hex, your familiar can draw on the waning strength of another creature. One creature within 15 feet of your familiar with less than half of its maximum HP becomes sickened 1 unless it succeeds a fort save against your spell DC. That is crazy. That's really nuts. It's a good way to get essentially the same kind of debuff as Frighten, because Frighten and Sicken do more or less the same thing. Sicken is a little stronger because the enemy needs to retch to get rid of it, but more or less they do the same thing. And as long as an enemy's at half HP, every time you cast or sustain a hex, they just have a chance of becoming sickened, which is scary. Mixing with Scrounger's Glee, this is an incredibly powerful patron because you have a fort save and a will save that oftentimes are one of those two are going to be a enemy's weak point. It's just how the game is kind of designed. Reflex tends to be somewhere more in the middle more often than not if it's not the high save. And if it is a high save, then it's guaranteed one of these are going to be the low save. So, yeah, it's honestly real crazy that this is just such a strong particular patron. I think it's very solid. And I think if you enjoy debuffing enemies and really giving to your team success that way, the Devour of Decay is definitely going to be the one for you. Next up, we have the Ripple in the Deep. This is essentially the patron of the depths, predominantly like things like the Kraken or other kinds of creatures that are deep, mysterious, primal in a sense. Also a primal one. I don't know why I need to mention this, but I'm doing it anyway. And its lesson, Surface and Seas, gives you access to the Sting of the Sea cantrip and your choice of either Dizzying Colors or Grease, both of which are pretty good spells. So, not a bad choice, but let's talk about Sting of the Sea. Sting of the Sea is a very weird cantrip and is predominantly better if you have a group that specializes in like hiding, for instance. So if you have a rogue on your team or really any character who likes to stealth a lot, this is going to be a pretty good one to use. So range of 30 feet, targets one creature, and it's a fort save, and you can sustain this spell. Essentially, when you use this one, the creature has a effect for as long as it's sustained, where at the beginning of its turn, it needs to roll a fort save to see what affects its vision for that round, as a blue portal opens up and some kind of tentacle or an enemy or some other kind of thing wraps around the target's face, which is cool thematically, though effect-wise, we'll look at it. So crit save, nothing happens, pretty typical. On a success, the target has a -2 penalty to perception checks involving vision until the end of its turn. That's honestly one of the worst kind of succeed effects because it's very specific. Now, obviously, this can come in handy if you have an ally who is stealthing or invisible, even, and the enemy is attempting to keep them at least like hidden and not like whatever the next one. I can't even remember. It's like unobserved or whatever above that, where it doesn't know what heck or square the character is in. But I just for a success effect, it's like most of the time nothing happens. The creature oftentimes just don't make seek checks. I mean, in my games, I guess, in your games, if creatures are making seek checks regularly, then I guess it's a different story. It's just not anything we've ever come up with in our many, many hours of playing the game. But on failure, the target is dazzled until the end of its turn, which makes everything concealed to it. That's pretty good. That's actually really, really powerful. And on a crit failure, it's blind until the end of its turn, which is even better because then everything is hidden to it. So Sting of the Sea has a really good effect if the enemy fails or crit fails. If it succeeds, it's more of just a minor hindrance in some niche situations, which makes it not as good as some of the other hex cantrips that are just generally better. Though I do have to say, with the Scrounger's Glee I just talked about in Devour of Decay, it doesn't do anything on success. So I guess I was giving that one a bunch of praise, but this one, it feels a little bit off. But to be fair, that one also just makes the target frightened, which is really good. This one just makes the creature dazzled, which is good. It reduces its accuracy by a sheer amount, but it doesn't necessarily make it killing it faster. It just makes it killing you slower, which is, it's okay. I like Sting of the Sea. I think it's really good. I don't take my criticisms as like a sign that this cantrip isn't good, and I like the themes behind it and everything like that. It was just, it followed up Devour of Decay, which is just a really rough one to follow up with. But hey, maybe the familiar is better. So for the familiar, we have the Overwhelming Tides. Now, this is actually a pretty insane familiar ability. So whenever you cast a Hex or sustain one, your familiar just gets to shove an enemy within 10 feet of it, 5 feet away. Now, not shove, it forces the creature to be pushed 5 feet away. 10 feet is really close, and your familiar is kind of squishy. But at the same time, this is just 100% forced movement. It can force an enemy every round. This makes this familiar a complete nuisance on the battlefield and can put some enemies into some really bad spots or even like shove them off a cliff if necessary. I think this is a very fun familiar to utilize. And I think if you're a very intelligent player or you have a team that's based on bullying, this is a very powerful familiar ability that can enhance that kind of play style. So Ripple in the Deep is very good overall. Sting of the Sea is a really good defensive hex cantrip, which many of them aren't as defensive as this one. And as well, the familiar ability is just really strong. Just forced movement all the time on an enemy is really good. And it's no save. It's nothing. So yeah, it's a pretty solid patron overall. The last patron we have here is Whisper of Wings. Now, this is a patron pretty much of the idea of wings descending upon you from somewhere you can't see. Kind of fills you with that primal fear in a sense that something is approaching you from out of your vision. It's very interesting. It's a very fun patron though. So let's look at what it does. First of all, we have a Lesson of the Observed Sky. This gives you Mermation, and your familiar learns Gentle Landing. Gentle Landing is a really good spell to have on hand, like, all the time. So, honestly, not a bad one. And let's look at Mermation. So, Mermation is also very interesting. It is another defensive one, but one I like a bit more than the, what was it, Sting of the Depths? Sting of the Sea, my bad. So what it does is it is a 30-foot range, and it's based on a will save, and you can sustain this one up for a minute. Singular action, as they tend to be. So you designate a creature and a target. The target can be you, and as long as and both of them do need to be within 30 feet of you, so that's important to know. And essentially what happens is once per round, if the target moves closer or if the creature that is the target of this spell moves closer to the target you designated for the spell, then they need to make a will save or they take a D4 piercing sonic damage on more or less a basic save, only it does do some extra stuff. So let's look at it here. Crit save, nothing happens. Success, the target takes half damage. Failure, they take the full damage. And on a crit failure, they take a D4 sonic and a D4 piercing. And if it attempts an attack roll or hostile skill check this round, it does so at a -2 status penalty to the roll. Now, the interesting thing about the critical failure here is it just says if it attempts an attack roll or hostile skill check at all. It doesn't even have to be against the designated target. So that being the case, the crit fail is pretty nasty. But the cool thing about this one that I really like is whenever this creature attempts to approach your designated target, they're likely to take at least some damage, which is really cool. Now, the heightening effect, though, I think has an error because it says the damage increases by a d4 on success or a 2d4 on critical success. That's not how the spell works, because on success, the target takes half damage. I don't think that's what they're intending. What I think they mean is the spell's damage increases by a d4 or by 2d4 on a crit failure, which means every level, every rank anyway, the spell goes up. It does a d4 extra base damage, and then if the creature crit fails the check, it takes that extra d4 sonic damage plus an extra d4 piercing damage. That's pretty much what I'm assuming here, but it's written incorrectly. So it's a really good one for a team that has a lot of people who want to keep their distance, mobility. Even if you have a character who is more like a fighter, just taking a 5-foot step back ensures the creature needs to step closer, and then forcing the creature to then make the save again. I like this one a lot. And now let's go ahead and look at what the familiar ability does. So the familiar is Nimble Flights. And what it does essentially is whenever you cast or sustain a hex, your familiar can fly up to 15 feet. This movement doesn't trigger reactions. That is a kind of bad familiar ability. So, like, your familiar abilities should predominantly be some hostile or debuffing action that the enemies don't want to happen, right? Because that's what it does. At base, at level 1, unless you pick up a specific ability for your familiar to use, this does nothing because your familiar being closer or moving or doing whatever is kind of pointless. Your familiar can just sit out the combat because your familiar doesn't do anything unless you have some kind of feat or ability that makes it do something. When it can do something, this is good at making sure the familiar is at least better at survival, can get away without necessarily getting hit. But most enemies don't have reactive strike, so the doesn't trigger reactions part isn't such a big deal. And the movement thing, I don't know. I would have preferred this be a feat that the witch picks up rather than be a straight up familiar ability. But I like Mermation, so Whisper of the Wings is gonna get a general okay from me. It's fine. I just don't like the familiar ability. All right. In addition to these new patrons, we also have 3 new greater lessons that you can select as a part of the greater lesson feat. This one gives you, so first of all, let's talk about Lesson of the Shark. Lesson of the Shark gives you Blood in the Water hex, and your familiar learns Feat Defends. Feat Defends is good when you need it, but Blood in the Water is an amazing hex. So Blood in the Water, we'll take a look at here, is a 2-action hex. Now it has a requirement that it can only be cast on an enemy that is currently taking persistent bleed damage, or your last action dealt slashing damage to the target. So if you are going the much reviled melee witch build, then you can do a slashing attack with your, Eldritch Nails probably, or a knife, and then you can cast this on the target and the effect happens. So it's based on a basic reflex saving throw, and you can sustain this up to a minute. You summon the spirits of aquatic predators to appear as a spectral swarm around the target, which is really cool. Whenever you cast or sustain this hex, the target takes 2d6 spirit damage with a basic reflex saving throw. And if the target is in water, they treat all water as difficult terrain as the predators try to drag them down for 1 round. So essentially until the start of your next turn. These spectral predators don't take up space, don't grant flanking, and cannot be attacked otherwise. Now, if you deal slashing damage to the target while the spell is active, you automatically sustain the spell. If you cast Blood in the Water while the previous version is up, that cancels the first one that you cast. And every odd spell rank past this one increases the damage by another 2d6. So Blood in the Water does a few things really well, but the thing I like about it most is how easy it is to sustain. So first of all, 2d6 damage is not a lot for a 3rd rank spell, and every 2 ranks getting an additional 2d6, it's not a very high damage spell. Now, making water difficult terrain, depending on the campaign, can be insanely good, but that's depending on the campaign, and most campaigns don't spend a significant enough time in water, though there are certain spells, especially primal spells, that can change this, which makes this really good at comboing with other types of spells. Last but not least, the sustaining part. Now, this is the part I really, really like. Because while, yeah, sure, you could use a dagger or slash the enemy in some other, martial fashion, which witches aren't known for doing super well, there are actually a fair number of spells that do slashing damage. And heck, there are even some melee like spell cantrips that allow you to slash with a claw that does slashing damage. So, this is a hex that sustains itself super easily, which means the enemy is always going to be taking probably some damage every round, potentially always suffering from difficult terrain. And it's just really, really good. Now, the requirements for setting it off are a little bit rough because some of your best methods of dealing slashing damage are spells, which Blood in the Water is also a spell. So you just don't have enough actions to use this typically. But if you do have an ally with a wounding rune on their weapon, which is a very popular rune, then this is a very easy spell to get off overall. So, Lesson of the Shark, Blood in the Water, both really, really good. Next up, we have Lesson of Decay. This gives you mycological melody, and your familiar learns insect form. Insect form can be really good. It has a lot of versatile uses in and outside of combat, but let's talk about mycological melody. So, mycological melody is in continuing with the same line that the Decay patron goes with. It is a fort save. It's 2 actions. You can sustain this one up to a minute, though it does have a range of touch. So, something you need to keep in mind. But essentially, more or less, what you do is you infect a target with what is called void cap spores. Now, the interesting thing about this particular disease that you're giving to enemies, this also affects corporeal undead like skeletons or zombies, and can even be argued with the GM it could work on some types of constructs that normally have disease immunity, like undead typically do as well. Like, for instance, if you're going against some kind of wooden construct creature, it can be said that this could work on that creature as long as it's made of some kind of organic thing. It's essentially a disease that works on things that typically are immune to diseases, which is kind of cool. And it makes a lot of sense for this one. Now, to be fair, a lot of these kind of creatures still tend to have really good fort saves, so it's still going to be a little bit of an uphill battle, but nonetheless, it's potentially really good, and this is a major debuffing hex as well. So what does it do? So if the target succeeds the check, they're just enfeebled 2 for a round, which is solid. Now, if they fail the check, they get void cap spores at stage 1, and if they crit fail, they get it at stage 2. What does void cap spores do? So stage 1 makes the enemy enfeebled 2, and it has a round before they need to make another check. At stage 2, they're enfeebled 2 and slowed 1, and then they get another round before they need to make another check. And at stage 3, they're enfeebled 2, slowed 1, and stupefied 2, and they have another round before they need to make another check. A really nasty disability. Now, to be fair, you do need to sustain it to keep it going, but this is a very solid one overall, as long as the enemy doesn't have particularly good fort saves. And heck, if they're at half HP, your familiar, if you're the Decay patron anyway, can just make an enemy sickened. Or you can just use your cantrip on them and they're frightened, and as long as you're sustaining that one. So, there's ways you can easily reduce their fort saves to make the void caps weaken them. Now, to be fair, this is mostly a defensive debuff because enfeeble just makes it harder for them to hit if their attacks aren't finesse and reduces some of their damage. Now, that's very strong in a lot of situations and incredibly powerful. And slowed is nothing to sniff at either, as well as stupefied too, which, depending on the type of enemy, might be even more devastating. So, mycological malady is really, really good if you want a really solid debuffing hex. And the last lesson here is Lesson of the Flock. Lesson of the Flock gives us Sheltering Wings hex, and your familiar learns Levitate. Levitate is an okay spell. I'm not a big fan of Levitate personally, but it does have its uses. But let's talk about Sheltering Wings. So Sheltering Wings is a very interesting hex, and to be honest, doesn't do very well with the Whisper of Wings Patron familiar ability, because it kind of does something similar. So what's it do, right? Sheltering Wings is a reaction hex or hex spell that targets an ally within a range of 15 feet who is currently moving through a square that's within 15 feet of you, or started their movement within 15 feet of you. What happens is, as a reaction, your familiar flies up to 30 feet, though it must move towards the triggering ally. If it ends its move adjacent to your ally, it clings to your ally, landing on their back, and until the beginning of your next turn, your familiar is automatically carried by the ally, and its wings provide cover. When the spell ends, your familiar hops off into an adjacent square, and it ends at the beginning of your next turn. So this one can't be sustained. What it does is essentially, until the beginning of your next turn, if your familiar was able to land on your ally, provide your ally with cover. Now, it doesn't state, and this is something that frustrates me, it doesn't state what kind of cover, but based on reading the rules and various assumptions, this has to be lesser cover. Lesser cover is stated as, if the cover is especially light, typically when it's provided by a creature, you have lesser cover. Less of cover just provides a +1 AC. That's it. It doesn't give you a bonus to stealth or to reflex saves like other types of cover does. So it's a hex spell that you can use as a reaction that provides an ally 1 AC and moves your familiar for a focus point. And it's not sustained. So if it was sustained, I could feel like this one would be a lot better overall, because then you have an ability where your familiar is on your ally, so all your familiar abilities, all the things that happen around your familiar, can continuously proc like wherever your ally is, which can be really good, and they get a +1 AC bonus, which is solid. But it is not sustained. It just moves your familiar and gives your ally 1 AC for a round, and it uses a reaction. Sheltering Wings is a really bad hex spell, if you ask me. I just don't see the use of it, and honestly, having the Whisper of Wings familiar ability, where it just on a hex it moves 15 feet without triggering reactions, does a lot of the same things that this one does, only it doesn't provide the AC bonus, obviously, and the familiar doesn't get to move, I guess, as far as your ally might move. But it's for free. It doesn't cost you a focus point. So if I was to try to make this work in a campaign, I would just let it be sustained, let my familiar just chill on my ally's shoulder and provide cover for the duration for sustaining. I feel like that has a lot more value. But other than that, Sheltering Wings is kind of bad. So I don't know. Let me know in the comments below. What do you think this is a good one? Am I wrong? I can be, for sure. Maybe I'm just not seeing the use, but at this moment, it's kind of like a D tier focus spell, which feels kind of bad. All right, now we're on to the feats, and that's about it for the end of the video. So just 3 feats and we're done. Another quick video, something I'm very happy about. First, let's start off with Scatter Swarm. Swarm is very interesting. It's an anti-swarm ability that you can use using your familiar, so it potentially could be really good. I feel like this is not a good feat pick, but if you can just have this somehow, or you get a free feat that you can select, it's definitely not a bad one. And depending on the type of campaign you are, when you're dealing with swarms, I can see the use. But anyway, what does it do, right? So essentially, any swarm that shares your familiar space takes damage equal to the swarm's weakness to area damage, which is usually not small. And you can choose whether this is acid damage, cold damage, electricity damage, or fire damage. And this action gains the trait of the damage type you choose. Once per round, your familiar can hurt a swarm by a pretty okay amount. Now, depending on how the swarm, if the swarm's already in your familiar space, this is pretty easy to use. And there are some ways to move familiars. Like, this is actually one of the feats that works really well with the Whisper of Wings particular familiar ability, because you can use a hex, your familiar can fly over to where a swarm is, and then it can use scatter. You can use scatter swarm with your remaining action, or if you have 2 actions and one of your 2 actions. It's solid. It's really good. It's a really good anti-swarm. Swarm enemies are so annoying because they're all super resistant to a lot of different types of damage that allies can do typically. So this is a really good way to have anti-swarm stuff. And I gotta say, scatter swarm might be good. Overall, I'll give this one a solid B. It's really handy when you need it, though I would need a good reason to take this in my campaign. Next up, though, is Portents of the horos. This is an insanely good feat. So level 4, you get a reaction that goes off whenever a creature within 30 feet of you is reduced to 0 hit points in a way that doesn't destroy their body. Now, destroy their body is a very subjective term. What does destroy mean? If I lop its head off, did it get destroyed? I think this is with the intent of, like, disintegrate. So can't use this on a creature that's been disintegrated, but more often than not, you can use this on most enemies that die. So what happens? As a reaction, you roll a d12. And then the next time before the end of your next turn that your ally deals the type of damage as determined by the d12 on this chart here below, the enemy will gain a weakness to that damage equal to your level, which is insane. So we have also higher chances of receiving the physical damage types, while the energy ones here, like acid, cold, electricity, fire, and mental and poison, are only 1 result. Bludgeoning is 2 and 3, piercing is 8 and 9, and slashing is 11 and 12. So, of this d12, 6 of the results are the physical damage types, which is really, really good. So that being the case, this is insanely good because your allies are likely to just do a bunch of damage on an enemy, and it's damage equal to your level. This doesn't cost anything. There's no focus point. Like, honestly, Portents of the horos would have made a better, like, focus spell than Sheltering Wings did before. I would pay a focus point for this ability. It's really, really good. So this is a insanely useful one. Now, obviously, there's a chance that you're just going to get a damage type that your allies really don't use, but that honestly is not a super big deal. Oh, well, whoops. We don't get to just drop a bunch of damage on an enemy this round when the witch used a reaction, which they normally don't have reactions for anyway. So it's almost free when you look at it that way. So yeah, Portents of the horos is an insanely good witch feat. All right, and the last feat we have here is the Wild Witch's Armament, and this one is going to be controversial just as much as the Witch's Armament is in the first place. So essentially what this does is it enhances the ability of the unarmed strikes you gain through Witch's Armaments. For Eldritch Nails, for instance, if you were to strike an enemy with 2 consecutive strikes, the enemy takes additional slashing damage equal to half your level on the second strike. Now, someone in a prior video did mention that consecutive did not have to be in the same turn, which is, I think, something a lot of people can debate. If that is the case, which, to be fair, I don't think there's a ruling specifically on what counts as consecutive, then, there's not a bad chance that the first strike in a round, your witch is likely to hit with a slashing attack. So this could mean that every other hits, which could be every other round, you could do additional slashing damage, and it does additional slashing damage equal to half your level, which is actually not that bad. Is that worth it, though? Witch strikes are not going to have the best, like, strength scaling, typically. And I also think that they don't get the same weapon specialization damage bonuses, or at least if they do, they're far delayed. So you're already just doing an action that is not super effective. If you're going for a melee witch build and that's what you find fun, obviously this might be for you. It's just effectiveness wise, I don't know. Now, if we're talking about picking this up on another character who's multi-class archetyping into witch, this feels a lot better. So overall, Elder Snails is okay. It's interesting, I guess, for some witch builds, and it's better for some mixed builds, but like, I don't know. Iron Teeth is interesting because what it does is when you critically hit with your jaw strike, the enemy must make a fort save or against your class CC or become sickened 1. Now, witch crits are not very common, so another one that's a little bit rougher. And that means you're dedicating a bunch of time to trying to fish for crits to do this, which is, arguably not the most effective. You can definitely do it, of course. But another one that works better with a class that's been intermixed with witch multi-class archetype feats. I mean, again, like martial witch is the way you're trying to go, which to be fair, there is a way to make a witch who is very close to a martial character with the use of spells. It takes a little bit of setup, but you can easily do so, and you're only 1 or 2 points behind, give or take. So I'm not saying that like a martial witch isn't feasible. It's just a very particular build, which makes this kind of feat just a lot more niche than it appears on the surface. The last one is the Living Hair, and I actually really like this one because it gives you a quill attack where you get a unarmed strike that deals a d4 piercing damage with a range increment of 15 feet, and they're in the dark group. I like the idea of getting an unarmed attack that does like a ranged unarmed attack for the witch. This feels a lot better. This feels like if you cast a spell and you're getting a free sustain every round or something like that, you can at least try to do some extra damage on it. Also, witches don't have a lot of spell attacks, so technically speaking, it's very easy to cast a spell and then attack with your full attack ability every round. I've seen this done in our current campaign that we're running in Kingmaker. So that being the case, I like the idea of having a range attack that you can use. And while Witch's Armament is just going to be a controversial feat, no matter really what I say, many people are just so hung up on the numbers that they're just like, there's no reason to absolutely do this. It's not playing to the witch's strengths. And there's going to be other people out there who are like, yeah, but I like it. It's cool. I want to play this way. And if we're being honest here, a couple point difference is not going to be a big deal, especially if your combat encounters are designed well and have a range of enemy levels and ACs where even the witch can easily hit an enemy because they're like 2 or 3 levels under the witch's level, which should be at least relatively more common. So a controversial feat. I like it. I like some of the things it does. It makes multi-classing into witch a lot more interesting as well, even though you'd have to be level 12 to select this feat, but I think it could be worth it if I'm being honest, especially the Eldritch Nails one. But yeah, so that's gonna be it for this video. Hopefully y'all enjoyed. I know it was a little bit rambly. I thought it was gonna be a little bit of a shorter video, but I rambled a lot in this one. Oh well. Hopefully you liked it nonetheless. Tomorrow we're gonna be talking about the mermaids. So if you are very interested in the mermaid stuff, check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.